Okay, so welcome to another live classroom session. I haven't done one in a few weeks just because of lack of time. But this one will be about drapery. Again, this one will be maybe a little bit more beginner friendly as we'll go over the different folds and some of its application and just the way I see things when it comes to folds. Now, this is definitely not. Again, as always, disclaimer, not the end-all be-all knowledge. There's definitely other resources covering this topic. And this is more of like my interpretation on the subject, and maybe you can take something away from it. So basically, like the way that I see folds is that I make a strong separation between two types of forces that are acting on our drapery. So basically, when we apply force to drapery, we create folds. That's kind of what happens. And I make a distinction between two types of forces. And one is compression. So I'm just going to put a big C right here. And the other one is tension. Right. So capital T. And with compression, what we usually see is compression is more of like an invisible force that is acting onto our drapery, whether that's like gravity or just the compression of cloth on a bar or between our limbs or whatever. It's more of like an invisible force that is, present on a larger surface of the drapery, right? So compression, I'm just going to use these green arrows. That's going to be relevant later. And then tension is more of like an active force. We can see this because the drapery is actually going towards that force, right? Or either radiating from it. And so tension is usually like a point that we use. And our folds are, radiating towards it. Okay, so with these two things in mind, let's go over our first type of folds. I'm going to try and go over all of them. So the first type of fold that we all probably know and that you've seen in previous videos on ArtWatt and, in this week's video as well is the pipe fold, right? So the pipe fold is basically like S-curves that are connected. Right, that make up our fold. And if we look at the center line, right, that's always good to think about. We kind of get the same thing. Now, the reason why we create these pipe folds is primarily due to compression. Okay, if we think about a piece of cloth lying on the floor, right, like this. So it's straight onto the floor. And we have like two imaginary walls or forces. Think of like some sort of Indiana Jones or Star Wars kind of scene where the walls are closing in, right? And so we have compression on two sides, like compressing this piece of cloth. And so the resulting shape that would appear is those sinus wave curves, right? Like this. Now, where do we see this type of fold primarily? Well, if we look at household objects, like our curtains are a prime example, right? If we look at our curtains, we can see sort of this sinus wave going on, both at the top and at the bottom. And this usually is because there are like connected to a rod or a bar at the top, and you'll sometimes see this bar peeking through the different folds. Right, like this. So the reason why these folds are being created is because on that rod, they're being compressed together. The cloth is being compressed together from both sides. Whether that's equally or unequally, that's relatively unimportant, but there's an invisible force grouping these folds together, creating those sinus waves. Another form that is often known, but maybe not familiar to you why that happens, is if we have, let's say, a skirt that is held together by a belt, right? So we have a belt. Like this. And then we have our skirt. Hanging from that belt. And so what we essentially see is that these pipe folds are being created here as well. Now the reason that is exactly the same as the curtain. If you think about it, compression is happening the exact same way, right? So we have compression from this side or compression at the back like this. Because if you were to take this rod from this curtain and basically bend it into a circle, right, then you would create this skirt. Does that make sense? All right, fantastic. Oh, and so before I forget, before I move on, now I'm saying this is like a beginner-friendly classroom, but you should always remember that in order to do drapery successfully, one of the prerequisites is knowing perspective, primarily knowing cylinders, because as you can see here with the pipe folds, these are basically half cylinders, right? At all times, we are twisting and turning cylinders in perspective, and also knowing figure anatomy or figure mannequins, right? Because your cloth is always dependent on the structure that's underneath it, right? If there's no structure underneath it, it will just, it collapse onto itself and become like inert folds. But you basically need something of points of tension or compression in order to create folds. And so having a good understanding of the underlying structure is pivotal. I'm just throwing it out there so that you know. All right, then moving on to our next fold, which is a drop fold, right? And it hasn't stolen its name. So a drop fold, what we see with drop folds is that they primarily come from one point of tension, right? And so if we drop a square piece of cloth from one point, we see that basically we get this sort of shape happening, right? And it's going back towards our point of tension, right? That's important. It's going back towards our point of tension. Now, if we were to take a triangular piece of cloth, essentially the same thing would happen. It would just look like this. Right? So something is going towards the point of tension. We can shade that in a little bit. Now, essentially, the drop folds could be considered the same thing as the pipe fold. And so what I'm trying to hopefully make you aware of in this classroom session is that all the other folds that I'm going to mention have somewhat of a correlation to the pipe fold, right? Because at all times we have some sort of compression happening, whether it's a very light sort of compression or a very heavy sort of compression. And at all times we're actually creating pipes, right? The folds are actually always pipes, but it's just the way that they're going towards points of tension depends on what kind of fold we're creating. And so with the drop fold, what you should realize is that, you know, like we have with the pipe fold, the main force that is happening is compression. With the drop fold, the main force that is happening is tension, right? That's the difference between the two. And so a drop fold is when you have like a cape hanging from your arm, right? Or your cloak is hanging from your arm. You have basically one point of tension, and then gravity is pulling it down. And your pipe folds are still being created, but they are compressed onto each other. And the best way that I can explain that is if we look at this drop fold from the bottom. Imagine that we have this piece of cloth, right? And we just do regular compression on it from both sides. The resulting piece would look, you know, something like this, right? Just a simple pipe fold. Now, if we were to just let gravity do its thing and let that fold go further and further and further, what we would see is that it would essentially droop up completely. Right? And kind of fold into itself, compressing itself, you know, together. Right, and that's essentially what's happened here with a drop fold, right? Those pipe folds are actually just getting squished together, right? And they're going towards one point of tension, right? So basically these folds are what you see here, and then they're radiating towards one point of tension. Does that make sense? Because I don't want to go too fast. Okay, great. Okay, and so you could have a combination of these two where you, and like I mentioned before, where you have the, you know, a piece of cloak hanging over your arm, right? We could have an arm, but then the first thing that we would see is there would be compression on that arm, like the arm is acting like the rod or the bar that we see here. So we would have, you know, sort of these pipe folds happening. And then that would droop down and then fold onto itself, right? And go towards that point of tension. Right? So you would have your arm here. Right? And so basically this is a combination of a pipe fold combined with a drop fold, because the drop fold is going towards the point of tension and then compressing, the pipes are getting compressed. But here, the main type of force on the arm is actually the compression from both sides, creating those pipes. All right, let me just zoom in a little so you can see. And then moving on to our third fold is the diaper fold, right? And so again, we're talking about compression versus tension. And with the diaper fold, we essentially have 2 points of tension. Right. So if we do the generic one, we have the 2 points of tension on either side, and then we hang a square piece of cloth, not at the corners, but like in the middle somewhere, between these points of tension. And so the resulting shape kind of looks like this. Right? And so, as you can see, in the beginning, this cloth is being manipulated by those points of tension, but the further we move away from those points, the less and less that that force becomes, and the more compression will take over. And so let me just complete this for a second. Okay, so it will look something like this. Right? Maybe not entirely, but close to it. And so to explain what happens is the diaper fold is being created by these 2 points of tension, right? So the lines are radiating outward from those points of tension, and they're going towards each other, creating these U shapes that are just get steeper and steeper the further they move away from those points. And at some point, instead of the force from the tension points, the compression takes over at the bottom, right? So compression will have more weight on that cloth. The force of compression will have more influence on that piece of cloth than the tension points. And that's why at the bottom of a diaper fold like this, we will see pipe folds, right? And at the left, or at the other side of those tension points on either side, we will see drop folds again, because these drop folds are not getting influenced by that point of tension, only by this point of tension. And so there, again, it's that rule of the 1 point of tension, right? Going towards 1 point of tension is exactly what's happening here with the diaper fold. The thing that I do see a lot of beginners get wrong is that they do not consider the volume of their pieces of drapery, right? So especially with diaper folds, you need to be aware of, well, essentially with any fold, but especially with diaper folds, you need to be aware of the thickness of your cloth, because it will highly depend on how many of these U shapes you will see and how thick they will be. And then having a good understanding of your center line and the thickness will definitely help. For instance, if we hang this piece of cloth in perspective, right, and let's say it's a rather big or thicker piece of cloth, right? We need to be aware of that. And so it's important that you think at all times about your center line and what thickness of folds they are creating, because that will help you, whether that's in drawing or in painting, with the shading application, right? Because I know now the contour lines of my folds that are being, created. I can more confidently shade in where my shadow shapes will appear and where my light shapes will appear, right? And that will create more believability when I draw this, whether that be from imagination or reference. Okay. Now let's look at, I have some reference here from medieval reenactment of some diaper fold examples. And so when I record this, by the way, I will include those reference photos in the video. But so we have a girl here that is holding up the dress of another woman. And so there are actually 3 points of tension, and they are all creating a diaper fold. So the first one is between the hands of the girl holding the piece of cloth, like this. There's a small drop fold here. And then this piece of cloth is going up again towards the skirt of that woman. And so this is the belt of the woman, right? And so we have another diaper fold being created. All right. Okay, so if you look at it, we have the 2 obvious points of tension created by the girl's hands holding that skirt up, right? And so we have those points of tension, and then they are radiating out. They're becoming less and less and less. But then we have the hip of the woman also creating a point of tension, to which we radiate, on the other side as well, but we don't get to see that, towards the tension points, right? And so if you can think about it like that, it also becomes easier to invent stuff from imagination. And, at the bottom here, this point of tension will have no more effect because gravity and compression is becoming a bigger force, especially at the bottom, as we saw here. And so here at the bottom, we will go back into diaper folds, right? And then reconnect. Because creating believable drapery will be having a nice balance between a combination of types of folds, right? And if you can do that successfully, you can create very believable drapery even without looking at reference, right? That's essentially what a lot of the concept artists do. Or you can look at reference that is completely non-relevant to either the perspective or the pose of your character, but you can read the information that's in the drapery and apply that onto your character, right? Let's look at one more that I have here for diaper folds, because it's a very commonly used fold. And so I have some sort of a holy guy sitting. This is like a medieval reenactment. I have some sort of a holy priest sitting on a horse, right? So this is a good one because a lot of the times people that will draw like a guy with a cape on a horse or like a hoodie, they will mess up the folds a lot of the times in the drapery. And so if we look at this guy, I'm just going to draw his head pretty generically. Right, and so he's sitting on the horse. And he has a cloak cloaked around him that is going over his arm, and we'll look at that later. And then it's going over his back. And so this is where your knowledge of anatomy comes in, right? So this is where you need to know the structure of your figures. It goes down. And then here, he's sitting on the horse, right? So we need to know somewhere where his middle is. He's the hip area, or the pelvis area of the horse is catching a lot of that weight of the cloak. And so it's draping around that pelvic area. Right. But this essentially, that hip of the horse becomes a point of tension. And we have his arm. Right here. With his hand. Like this, he's holding the reins of the horse. And it's being held together by some sort of a cool band. I'm not going to draw that in detail because that's not important. And so when we think about it, we have one point of tension created here because that fold needs to droop over that arm. And so this will essentially be a drop fold, right? So we'll get somewhat of a drop fold here first that will radiate towards that point of tension back, right? But then that other force of that other tension point will take over. And so we'll no longer have a drop fold, but it will become a diaper fold. That makes up the majority of these folds. Right? Okay, so does that make sense so far? Alexander, diaper folds will always have a combination of a drop and pipe fold in different quantities. Well, not necessarily a drop fold, Alexander or Minlowan. So usually a diaper fold can exist onto itself. It will usually end up in like a pipe fold, but it won't necessarily need drop folds. Drop folds happen because there's excess clothing on either ends of the tension points that will drop off that tension point, right? But if you, for instance, just hang the cloth by its corners already so that there's no access over those points of tension, there won't be any drop folds. And I think a good example of this is if you look at like a loincloth, right? Like from a belt, that loincloth will create a diaper fold first, and then it will sort of become just a pipe fold, right? But there's no drop fold happening there. Unless, again, you go underneath the belt with some excess cloth that is drooping over here and then creates a drop fold. But that depends on, again, you at all times you need to think or consider what kind of drapery you're using, the access, and the tension points. That's important, and that's what I want you to take away from this classroom. Okay, moving on. We have spiral folds. All right, so spiral folds, and I'm going to try to explain this in steps to hopefully make this understandable, is let's consider that we have a simple cylinder, right? Simple cylinder. And we have cloth hanging over that cylinder, right? And this time, like, nothing is affecting this piece of cloth, which is virtually impossible, by the way. But for the sake of argument, let's say that it is. Right? So this piece of cloth is hanging over this cylinder. Now, when we apply compression, right? Remember compression in green, on both sides of this drapery, then our cloth will probably look a little bit like this, you know? So again, what we're essentially creating is pipe folds, right? These are all, if we consider the center line, these are all pipes and sinus waves being created equally. Now this rarely happens, very, very rarely. Usually what we see with this kind of compression is that it becomes a zigzag fold. Now, that aside, we're first going to do spiral folds. So how does this become a spiral fold? The reason it becomes a spiral fold is because of twisting. And it becomes a spiral fold because instead of only having compression, due to twisting, we are creating a point of tension as well. And the best way that I can explain this, and there are probably other resources that do it more successfully than I can, but that's just the way I'm thinking about it. Let's consider this cloth isn't here. We're only thinking about the cylinder, right? And this cylinder exists of two parts. We have one cylinder like this, and then the other cylinder connected to that, sort of like something robotic, right? And the points of tension in this example are equal, right? But let's say that we only twist, we like start turning this cylinder, only like the right hand side cylinder, right? We start twisting it maybe that way, right? So instead of the points of tension looking like this, they look like this. One point of tension here and one point of tension here, right? Now we've essentially created a twist. And so what that results in, I hope you can still see that. I'm gonna up my page a bit, is that those folds still do the same thing essentially as the pipe folds almost, a bit more unevenly. But they start following the force that is being applied, which is that twist, right? And now this is why it's important for you to understand the underlying structure of where you're drawing your drapery on. Because if you don't understand that, especially with a spiral fold, you won't be able to draw the spiral correctly because you don't know how to follow the contour lines, right? And that's essentially super important. And so the way that you can consider this is that if we just take one of those pipes that are being created, it's essentially a pipe fold wrapping around this cylinder, right? In the direction of the twist. That's important. And then depending on the thickness of your drape or clothing or whatever, that it's either going to be, if it's like silk or satin, right? And that's why I want you to do the different materials this week. If it's like silk or satin, you're going to see a lot of pipe folds, right? Super grouped together, very obvious. If it's thicker cloth, it's not going to be that obvious. There's not going to be as many pipes that are following the twist, and it's going to be a lot more subtle, right? Even with like super thick cloth, you won't even see connected spirals. It will just be like maybe something like this, and then an overlap of this, but then everything else will be super subtle because that thick cloth isn't getting manipulated as much by that twist. Does that make sense? Or am I talking gibberish? All right. Good to know. So let's really think about those concepts because it's important when you're making stuff up or just drawing from reference. If you already, even when you're drawing from reference, and do this week as well, think about the forces that are being applied. Think about compression versus tension, right? There's always a balance between the two. And I think let's just visualize that a bit as well. So with a pipe fold, we primarily only have compression, right? This is like the amount of force from compression. If we have a drop fold without anything else, like this is the amount of tension force, right? It's only tension. If we look at like a diaper fold, there's like a lot of tension, but there's also a bit of compression. Right? And then with the twist, or spiral fold, sorry, there's like some tension and also some compression, right? It's like equally, almost. Okay, and then moving on to zigzag fold, which is, for me, and I'm not gonna be the best resource on this for you guys because I haven't, like, I've thought about all the folds a lot and how to explain them, but the zigzag fold is kind of the odd duck in the row. It's the thing with the zigzag fold is that when you look at it, the name definitely isn't stolen, right? So what happens, and you can see this on your sleeve and your, your pants or your trousers or whatever. It's called a zigzag fold because the tension is basically, and it's both tension and compression, right? So it's almost also like equally a bit more compression than there is tension, I would say. Right. But so those tension points are zigzagging off of each other, right? That's why it's called a zigzag fold. And that's what you can physically see happening when you look at a fold like this. The thing is, though, is you'll also have these inert folds happening, internal folds, that create these kind of X patterns. And the reason that is because with a zigzag fold, there's sort of, if you look at this fold, right, the equal pipe folds being created due to compression, this is because it's evenly compressed, right? There's no twist, no tension, no nothing. So it's evenly compressed, so it creates these pipe folds. With the diaper fold, I think it's primarily created because there are little nuances of tension going on everywhere. And so these are creating these zigzaggy patterns, right? And then because they're unevenly compressed, those pipe folds get bunched up in the middle as well, creating bumps, right? Creating like bumps like this and then go inward, bumps like that, go inward. And so those bumps also protrude and create those internal X-like patterns, right? So that's like the best way that I have to explain it. It's a really odd concept, the zigzag folds, and kind of an odd duck. But the most noticeable application of it is almost always in like pants or sleeves, just where there's like no force really going on. It's just because it's wrapped around your arm, right? So we have a sleeve, right, like this, some sort of a medieval sleeve, let's call it. We can see that tension happening or that compression happening onto that sleeve. In like a resting position, primarily. And so depending on the thickness of that sleeve or the material, we will either see a lot of zigzag or very subtle amounts of these zigzag folds, right? But usually they'll like rhythmically offset each other. And then if you shape this accordingly, you can create a lot of volume. So that's like the best or the most common application for this zigzag pattern. Now the last fold is called the half-lock fold, right? And the best way to explain the half-lock fold is just when a pipe fold abruptly changes direction, right? So it comes across another pipe fold that is abruptly changing direction. And those folds kind of overlap each other. And so the most common example where you see this is, of course, with your sleeves as well, right? Let me just look at a medieval example here. Right. So again, when you have a sleeve, and instead of your arm resting downwards, your arm is like this. This is your upper arm, and then your lower arm does this, right? So what we see happening is that we have zigzag folds occurring. Again, as always. Let's make this a wider sleeve, like this. And some spiral folds happening because usually our arm, and I don't know if you guys can see my arm, but our arm is rested like this. But if you twist your arm like this, right, so your radius will turn, right, will twist, and that's that cylinder example that I did before, right? So the fabric will twist along with it, and so you will get these very subtle spiral folds. And then because of the thickness of the clothing, that fold will kind of wrap onto itself. And because it wraps onto itself, it again creates like a bump on the outer edge. Right? Because basically that pipe fault wants to continue onto itself. Right? And that's what they call a half lock. Right? And if you look at like a real life example of that, I have another like medieval example here from a reenactment. And so this is like this guy is wearing a super, and again I'll link this in the video. This guy is wearing super wide sleeves, right? And so what we see from that is that this is his elbow, and then he kind of has his arms bent and on his hip, right? For you to understand. So this is his shoulder, right? So his shoulder's coming in like this, and that upper sleeve is creating somewhat of a spiral fold, and then going down, and then connecting with that lower sleeve. So we have the lower sleeve like this. Again, we have some tension of the elbow being created. Right? And so this is where the half lock is happening. And the special thing in this case is like there's several half locks being created. So because this sleeve is so wide and so big, it's creating one half lock that is kind of morphing into a spiral fold. And then another half lock that is locking onto itself like this. And then within that half lock, there's even another smaller half lock, right? And so when we go to shade this, that might become a little bit more apparent. All right, so basically all these kind of half lock or folds are folding onto themselves. That's basically what a half lock does. But the most common way that it's being represented by artists and especially draftsmen is that we will just create like a thicker fold and then let it lock onto itself like this and then continue. And this will basically give you the illusion of a half lock. And the most commonly used ways is like in the cavity between your upper arm and your lower arm, or when you bend your knees. Okay, we have two questions. Would tension force overpower compression force? Yes, but it depends on the situation, Howie. Where's my notes? I have so many notes. Okay, so in this case, when the cloth droops down, the tension force overpowers the compression force, right? There is no, well, there is compression going on here, but because of the force of gravity, those folds are, being compressed together and going towards one tension point. And so that's the tension taking over. And in this case, in the diaper case, that's the best example, because at the bottom we have compression creating pipe folds, but because of those two tension points here radiating towards each other, those are the tension forces that overcompensate or overtake the compression. And so even more compression or change in direction on the spiral fold will create a half. Yeah, exactly. Right. So if you change direction abruptly, you essentially create a half lock fold, because we have like normal two like folds, but then one is completely changing direction, so it's kind of folding onto itself, kind of, you know, encapsulating one. That's at least my understanding of it. I'm not sure if it's the definition of it, but that's how I use it in my designs, in my costume designs, in my character designs, and it seems to work. Right, I think that's it. Do you guys have any other questions? Was it clear, comprehensive? Do you have a better understanding of folds now? Do you have a worse understanding of folds now? All right. All right. Cool. One of the main things, the main difficulties, and that's the last thing I'll say, that you'll run into is conveying thickness in your clothing. So a lot of the time when I see people draw a cloak, for instance, I'm not going to say they tended to do it incorrectly, but with the material that they want to convey, it is being drawn incorrectly. And what I mean by that is, let me just see if I can explain this properly. So if we have a random piece of clothing, or let's call this a cape, right? Let's just call it for what it is. Right, and we have pipe folds being created and whatnot. Right. So a lot of the times what beginners will do, or even I will do, you know, is connect all these folds. Right. The thing is, though, that now there's no explanation as to how thick this is. So this, when you connect everything, it feels very, very thin, right? And it comes down to having a good knowledge of edge control and where your folds actually turn in space. Again, this is why perspective is important, knowing your cylinders, that you can sort of skip and not connect these lines, sort of create those T lines that you've heard about, right, to some degree, or even not connect the lines to indicate thickness. And I'm probably going to screw this up royally, but we can try. So if we do the same piece of clothing, what that might look like is, instead of connecting it all the way, we kind of do it like this, right? And then overlap it like that. And then again, create overlap, and then even internally, we keep overlap like this, right? And so what you're essentially doing is you're conveying more thickness to your cloak, right? Instead of it just being super thin. But it comes down to being patient and knowing where to overlap your clothing or your folds. It's same thing here with the sleeve, right? Instead of it being just connecting it completely, even if you have your arm through this, right? Instead of doing this, right, which essentially creates or gives the illusion that it's very thin, we offset these folds, right, to suggest thickness. And that's it. So that's all I wanted to cover. So hope you guys liked it. Do you have any further questions, or we good to go? Yeah. Yeah, Jonathan. So that's gonna be for you to figure out a bit this week, right? The thing to know is that you can indicate thickness, and as I said with the diaper folds, you need to, if the cloth is thicker, you know that the folds are going to be less, right? And they're also going to be bigger in volume, and so you need to be aware of your center line and the thickness of your folds in order to convincingly display that in the folds that you're creating. And so when you're draping, if you're doing the hardcore section this week and you're draping your fold or your piece of drapery over a rectangle or a box and a sphere and a cylinder, you need to take those things into consideration. And again, that's going to be for you to figure out. If you do it, if you really think about it, the forces of tension and everything like that, then you should take a lot away from this week. So I hope you do. And again, thank you all for attending. I'm going to leave you at that. Definitely, I've recorded this. Well, I hope I recorded this. I did. So I'll upload it to the website tomorrow. All right. Cool, guys. Thanks all for joining, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.